The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is now in session. La Giunta Tribunal Penal International for ex-Yugoslavia at 08. Please be seated.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mr. Vujic. Yes, Mr. Tigo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Honors, in response to your question on the 2nd of October at transcript 48033, seeking clarity over the final brief's reference to count 7 in relation to Srebrenica, your Honors are correct. We have previously stated that count 7 is not charged in relation to Srebrenica, and of course we maintain that position. We are grateful to your Honors for the opportunity, therefore, to correct the record. We do not seek a finding that Karadžić is responsible for the crime of deportation, count 7, in relation to Srebrenica. Additionally, after the defense closing argument, the trial chamber inquired why the prosecution could not make its declaration with respect to incidents and charges on which no evidence was presented after the closing argument, that is in relation to 73 bis. So let me do so now accordingly. The prosecution does not intend to proceed further with the incidents and charges against the accused which have been excluded pursuant to Rule 73 bis.
Thank you, Mr. Tigo.
Mr. President, your Honors, I now...
Just one
Yes.
second. Once we dealt with deportation, having heard all the evidence and also heard the closing argument, what specific incidents are charged as deportation in municipalities?
It would be difficult to recite the totality. I mean, those would be...
If you could come back after the
Sure.
session.
I mean, they would encompass basically the entirety of the overarching JCE.
Yes.
So I'll see if there's some compact way to define that for the court's benefit rather than by reference to the overall charges.
And when you come back, could you also address the chamber as to the elements that distinguish deportation from forcible transfer, in particular in terms of the accused mens rea?
Very well.
Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me proceed then to address some of the positions taken by the accused during his closing submissions. At transcript 47885, Dr. Karadžić stated that he, quote, did not introduce a state of war in Republika Srpska so that the life of ordinary citizens would not become militarized, unquote. That is false. Apart from the fact that it would have changed little for ordinary citizens, and see, for example, P970, pages 104 and 334, the real reason that Karadžić did not introduce a state of war was to make it easier to ensure that expelled non-Serbs would not return. And he explained this contemporaneously in the context of an assembly discussion in September 1992. That's at D456, a discussion about the borders of Republika Srpska and about ensuring separation from the Muslims and Croats. At that time, Karadžić distinguished between, quote, external, unquote, borders, that is, those that separated Bosnia and Herzegovina from Serbia or the Serbian Krajina in Croatia, and, quote, internal, unquote, borders, that is, those that would separate the Bosnian Serbs from Muslims and Croats within Bosnia. And he said, quote, "We'll accept the external borders on condition that we get the internal borders. But we will do everything we can to make the internal borders thicker than the external ones without publicly saying so. Our borders towards the Muslims and Croats are to be thicker than our borders towards Serbia and Montenegro and the Serbian Krajina," unquote. D456, page 55. In other words, quote, "thicker borders," unquote, separating Serbs from Muslims and Croats would prevent the Muslims and Croats from crossing those borders and changing the newly formed demographics. Karadžić then explained why a state of war had not been imposed, and that's at page 57. Quote, "We have refrained from introducing a state of war because it is much more important, more founded and feasible, if something is done by the civilian authorities without a state of war, under regular circumstances, such as settlement and resettlement. When the civilian authorities do this, it is much better. It is not discarded after the war," unquote. So, contrary to Karadžić's claim to you last week that he refrained from introducing a state of war in order to normalize conditions of life in Republika Srpska, he did so to ensure the permanence of the forcible transfers that had been and were being carried out, reasoning that if people are moved out and resettled under the apparent auspices of the regular civilian authorities, then this will not be reversed after the war. Now, that alone is sufficient to expose as false Karadžić's claim that all citizens who left the territory could return to their homes when they wished. Claims that were recognized by internationals at the time as, quote, "completely nonsense," unquote, because they were made in the context of ongoing ethnic cleansing. And see the paragraph 80 of the confidential prosecution brief. But even if, and even though, Dr. Karadžić couldn't sell this to the internationals at the time, he now tries to sell it to you, repeating the claim multiple times in the course of his submissions. For example, T47899 and T48029. He claimed at 47899 that he, quote, "rejected the speech of the member of parliament who was saying that the refugees would not be able to return or that mosques were destroyed," unquote, and that after this meeting he signed a declaration enabling the return of refugees. This reference to his reaction to the speech at the assembly session is another blatant mischaracterization. The precise opposite is true. That deputy, Viestica, did not say that the refugees would not be able to return. He was expressing concern that the latest peace proposal would permit them to come back. And Karadžić assured him and the assembly that it was not true and there was no need to worry. As he explained, quote, "This is what was said about the control of the borders. We will have barbed wire for 10 years, unquote. P1379, pages 25 through 26. As Karadžić stated at the 46th Assembly, P1403, page 157, his forces had created new demographic realities that he intended to maintain. Quote, "We have created new realities. If you want to give Zvornik to the Muslims, then you have to wage a new war in order to expel those Serbs back to Zenica," unquote. and Karadžić assured his followers that he would maintain that reality despite any purported commitment to return required by international agreements. So when the president of the Deputies Club, Vojo Maksimović, advocated that non-Serbs be openly banned from returning to areas under Serb control, and expressed concern that aspects of the peace proposals would trigger the return of Muslims and Croats, stating, quote, "Any thought about having 500 or more Muslims within our future country is out of the question," unquote. P. 1385, pages 126 through 127. When he expressed that concern, Karadžić explained the strategy that would provide lip service to the principle of return, but frustrate it in practice. Quote, "As to the return of the refugees, I owe an answer to Vojo's question. According to international law, we have no right to ban the return of the refugees. In principle, all refugees can return. But I would just add one sentence. This also has to be a two-way process." Unquote. Karadžić recalled that a puzzled Owen had asked, quote, "Why do you insist on a two-way process?" Unquote. And then Karadžić explained it to the assembly. Quote, "When the Serbs from Zvornik return to Zenica, then the Muslims from Prijedor will return to Prijedor. Therefore, it must be a two-way process," unquote. That's at page 132 of that session. And just in case that wasn't clear enough, he explained it again at a subsequent assembly session, the 53rd Assembly in 1995, when the same issue was presented by the latest peace plan's inclusion of language regarding, quote, "the right of refugees and displaced persons to be able to return to their homes," unquote. Karadžić again emphasized that the RS would insist on, quote, "an overall process," unquote. And he explained how this overall process would effectively prevent non-Serbs from returning. Quote, "That means that the Muslims from Kozluk can return to Kozluk if the Serbs from Kozluk return to Zenica. If they don't want to return, then we need, and if they cannot return, then we need a new war to exchange that. And that's why I think we should always insist on this. So, an overall process, either overall or none at all," unquote. Karadžić then pointed out the cleverness of his ploy. Quote, "We can act the Serbian Cyrillic way and tell it to their face, or we can be a bit cunning. We do have to be a bit cunning," unquote. Karadžić's cunning approach fooled no one then and should not fool you now. At transcript 47861, Karadžić challenged the prosecution's position about the Kudalero plan, stating, quote, "We accepted the maps, and I had to tell the MPs that we were not accepting the maps because otherwise we would have had a very difficult situation in Parliament," unquote. Kudalero, Karadžić's witness, made clear that Karadžić's claim that he, quote, "accepted the maps," unquote, is false. Kudalero explained that the map that was attached to the statement of principles was, quote, "a preliminary map," unquote, which merely reflected the existing absolute and relative majorities in the municipalities across Bosnia. That's T 33962 and 33965. There was nothing to accept or not accept It was the existing situation and therefore the starting point for any further discussions. It was obvious, as Cudolero testified, that any discussion of what territory would be encompassed by what entity would be a source of major upcoming dispute. And therefore, Cudolero explained, it was going to be the object of a working group to define borders precisely. Quote, "But that work was never done," unquote. That's at T33961. And although Karadžić insists on the contrary to you now, he never put that to his own witness, Cudolero, and never attempted to suggest that Cudolero was wrong when he said nothing moved beyond the meaningless map that was attached to the statement of principles. Cudolero also made clear that, that those negotiations never reached the agreement stage. The agreement in principles was merely a preliminary step toward further negotiations. That's at T33955. Karadžić himself emphasized at the time that the agreement was not final, that is, the statement of principles was not a final agreement, and it made clear that he never intended to honor even those preliminary principles. He reassured the Assembly, first, that the document, quote, "is not final," unquote, and it, quote, "has not been signed," unquote. That's at D90, page 6. He emphasized that he would, quote, "never have signed this paper as a document. Never, never, never," unquote. That's at D90, page 43. One of the reasons the agreement in principles was unacceptable to Karadžić was that, as Cudolero confirmed at T33958, it contemplated that Bosnia would be a single state. In February 1995, after Karadžić had succeeded in forcibly creating a largely monoethnic Serb state, he recalled, quote, "The first principle, or the first position in all Cudolero principles, if you remember, was that Bosnia was a state consisting of this and that. But it always said that Bosnia was a state, and we never accepted that," unquote. That's at P1407, page 116. Karadžić's repeated invocation of the Cudolero Agreement to justify the implementation of the common criminal purpose is not only conceptually flawed, but grounded on falsehoods. And speaking of falsehoods, at T47867, Karadžić said, quote, "And the table made by Eva Tabot shows that more Muslims left municipalities after the Dayton Accords than before. When the war was over, when the borders were clear, people started moving. Until then, they stayed, although they had the option to sign up for convoys and didn't use that option," unquote. This astonishing claim is based on a manipulation of one of Dr. Tabot's tables during cross-examination at T28349 through 71. When Karadžić asked about the percentage of people who left after the war in comparison to the percentage who left between 1991 and 1995. Perhaps we can use Prijedor and Sanski Most, two municipalities I discussed last week, as examples of this manipulation. So, as you can see, according to P5010, page 4, table 2, as well as Tabot's testimony at T28169 through 70, there were 49,351 Muslims in Prijedor in 1991. 42,000 had moved out by 1993, and 3,600 remained in 1995. Equally, according to the table, 28,136 Muslims were in Sansky Most in 1991, 24,000 had moved out by 1993, and approximately 3,350 were left in 1995. Now, although the RS sources for the mid-conflict figures are different sources than Thabot's statistical sources, these figures unmistakably reveal that the vast majority of Muslims were gone by 1995. But not to Dr. Karadžić, who insisted on pointing out in cross-examination the percentage of decline between 1995 and 1997. A highly misleading and meaningless figure because by far the biggest part of the population change took place before. And indeed, if you check the Priador statistics, even that claim is factually in error, even that meaningless claim, because in fact in Priador, the percentage between 1995 and 1997 is slightly higher than the percentage before. In any event, Dr. Karadžić now trots out this irrelevant argument again, this time dressing it up as if it was about raw numbers instead of percentages, and hoping no one will notice. This is as disingenuous as saying that you're happy for everyone to return, even as you're kicking them out, and hoping no one will notice. And we'll see more of this approach when we discuss his Sarajevo arguments. Your Honors, some points were raised regarding count 1 of the indictment. Now, first, contrary to the defense suggestion, this count does not turn on any specific pieces of evidence that the appeals chamber cited as examples that alone were sufficient to support a 98 bis finding. Those were merely exemplars for the totality of the evidence supporting the finding. In any event, the thrust of the defense submission is that the chamber should essentially defer to or is constrained by the findings in other cases, including Brzezanin, Karadžić, and even the Eichmann case. As you have noted previously, and as the appeals chamber itself noted in response to essentially the same argument, that's found at para 94 of their decision, this chamber must adjudicate count 1 based on the totality of the evidence on the record in this case. In assessing the intent of the accused, it is necessary to consider, amongst the totality of that evidence, the inference that arises from acts attributable to him. Many of the destructive acts against the Muslim and Croat communities were committed by his army and his police. By contrast, none of the accused in previous cases were the president of the RS and supreme commander. Indeed, Karadžić himself elicited evidence from both Karadžić and Brzezanin that underscores their more limited authority over those organs. He led evidence, for instance, that Karadžić could not issue orders to the army or the police. That's D4195 at paras 20 through 21. Organs that Karadžić acknowledged were responsible for widespread destructive acts. That's T45220 through 22. And he led evidence that Brzezanin did not have command authority over the army. That's D4034 at paragraph 38. Karadžić is now attempting to draw analogies to their cases, analogies that are rendered inapt by virtue of the very evidence he led. Additionally, the defense ignores that the Karadžić case did not involve a vertical JCE going up to Karadžić, although the trial chamber in that case went out of its way to note the indications that there was one. That's trial judgment at para 551. Yet while Karadžić did not command the army and police that participated so significantly in destructive acts in Prijedor, the Karadžić Appeals Chamber found, based on the evidence in that case, that a reasonable trial chamber could have found Karadžić responsible for genocide, although it was not prepared to overturn the trial chamber's determination. The defense also cited the Eichmann case, asserting that the failure to convict Eichmann of genocide for the 2-year period when Jews were deported rather than exterminated supports the defense position. It does not. The Eichmann case, which distinguished between the period of deportations and the commencement of exterminations, merely confirms the obvious, that forcible transfer alone does not constitute genocide, as I observed in our closing submissions. And 1 or 2 genocidal acts appended to forcible transfer would not ipso facto transform it into genocide. But that is very far from the case here, with thousands and thousands of genocidal acts. In citing the Eichmann case, the defense attempts to suggest that this is a deportation rather than a genocidal case, as if they are somehow mutually exclusive. Genocidal intent often embraces the forcible displacement of a significant segment of the population. You need look no further than the Srebrenica precedents from this tribunal to clearly see that destructive acts and forcible transfer can combine very effectively to reflect genocidal intent. As Judge Shahabuddin stated, quote, "Standing alone, forcible transfer did not constitute genocide. But in this case, the transfer did not stand alone. It was part, an integral part, of one single scheme to commit genocide, involving killings, forcible transfer, and destruction of homes." That's the Karadžić appeal judgment, separate opinion of Judge Shahabuddin at paragraph 35. The determination of genocidal intent arises from, in addition to direct evidence from the mouth of the accused, the combined effect of the acts that the accused intentionally inflicted on the community and its foundations of life. An assessment of that combined intent on the community necessarily embraces forcible displacement, in addition to killings and other genocidal acts. Similarly, Your Honors, it does not matter if the motive for destruction, for example, to create a, quote, secure, unquote, ethnically separate territory, is one that might have been achieved through means other than the destruction of the community. The issue is the intent that accompanies the genocidal and other destructive acts. And when one kills thousands, traumatizes, imprisons, debilitates thousands more, destroys most homes and sacred objects, and scatters group members to the winds, the intent to destroy that community inescapably follows. Finally, the defense does something here that they did throughout the course of their submissions.
Before going further, Mr. Tiga, you distinguished the accused case from the cases of Karadžić and Brzezanin. How would you distinguish his case from the case of Karadžić then?
Well, first of all, you'd have to look at the precise evidence in the case, but as you are well aware from Mr. Karadžić's testimony here, he was not the supreme commander of the military, and he purported not to be. The evidence in that case reflected in the judgment did not turn on that sort of finding. Further, the expressions of intent came directly out of this accused's mouth, not his. There are a battery of distinctions in that particular case, aside from the nuances of the particular evidence and the totality of the evidence which the court in that case had to assess. Further, this court would have to, if making such a distinction indeed had relevance, and I would suggest it does not, then this court would have to determine the extent to which any previous trial chamber may have become caught up in the supposed dichotomy between forcible transfer and genocide, without appreciating the contribution that forcible transfer may make to establishing genocidal intent. So there are many ways of distinguishing the Karadžić case, but as I mentioned before, it is for this chamber, based on the totality of the evidence, which is unprecedented, I would suggest, whether or not the genocidal acts attributable to Dr. Karadžić were accompanied by the requisite intent. Mr. President, I was indicating, I'm sorry, I don't know if the court wanted to continue with that.
I was waiting for the translation. Please continue. Thank you, Mr. Teague.
Mr. President, I had mentioned motive, and then the focus, the fact that the focus needs to be on the intent, not the motive. Then I went on to say that there was an effort by the defense to do something we see permeating their submissions. And that was the attempt to suggest an innocuous interpretation for Dr. Karadžić's repeated statements about the extinction, annihilation, and bloodshed that awaited Bosnian Muslims and Croats. And in doing so, he asked your honors to look at the evidence piecemeal, divorced from the overall pattern of crimes that took place. Now, taken in isolation, both from other statements and also, more importantly, from the overall context, the significance and meaning of those statements might theoretically be susceptible of various interpretations. But those statements did not occur in isolation. They were made by the most powerful leader of the Bosnian Serbs, a man at the helm of the forces that would implement his policies through countless destructive acts against the Bosnian Muslim and Bosnian Croat communities. Those acts, which reveal an unmistakable intent to destroy the foundations of life of those communities, blow away any fanciful interpretations of Dr. Karadžić's statements and confirm them as direct expressions of his intent. Mr. President, your honors, let me turn to some of the defense submissions on Sarajevo. And on the heels of the discussion about the attempted manipulation of Tabo's statistics, let me first turn to another effort at statistical charlatanism. The accused claimed, with respect to Markali 1, that Dr. Zečević asserted that the projectile entered at a 60-degree angle and claimed a margin of error of 33%. That's his claim. That means, according to Dr. Karadžić, that it could have been between 40 degrees and 79.8 degrees, a, quote, huge range, unquote, and therefore it, quote, could have been fired by anyone but the Chinese, unquote. That's a T48005. These statistics have nothing to do with Zečević's analysis and everything to do with Karadžić's special statistical manipulations. Follow how he gets there. 1, based on the configuration of the surrounding buildings, all agree that the minimum and maximum angles at which the projectile might have descended was between 50 degrees and the very steep 85 degrees. That is, somewhere within this 35-degree range. 2, Zečević actually calculated that the projectile descended at a 60-degree angle, plus or minus 5 degrees. 3, Dr. Zečević's 10-degree margin of error reflected approximately 33% of the total 35-degree range, a margin of error that Karadžić's expert Alsop agreed was, quote, generous, unquote. 4, with no mathematical or evidentiary basis whatsoever, Karadžić then reapplies that 33% to Zečević's 60-degree finding, angle of descent finding, coming up with a new range of error of nearly plus or minus 20 degrees and attributing it to Zečević, when in fact Zečević actually said it was plus or minus 5. And all of that tortured logic is an effort to obscure the important fact, which is that when Dr. Karadžić's expert, Dr. Alsop, was asked whether Zečević's generous margin of error of plus or minus 5 degrees addressed all of Alsop's concerns about possible variables, and therefore allowed for a sufficiently accurate determination of the fire distance, when Dr. Alsop was asked that, he answered that it did. That's at T29508 through 09. During his submissions regarding Sarajevo, Dr. Karadžić made generalized claims of alleged selectivity by the prosecution, finally attempting to distill it with an alleged example at T48007. He claimed that the prosecution failed to quote in full a document in which the last omitted line reveals the opposite of what is claimed. But the reality is that it is Karadžić, once again, who omits the critical portion of the document. Now, he was referring to an excerpt from Banbury's diary, quoting him as saying, that is, quoting Karadžić as saying, quote, retaliation is productive. When they shell Doughboy and we retaliate, it's effective. And you see that on the screen in front of you. That's the, and he showed the court that slide. The slide which shows General Janvier confronting Karadžić with the fact that this retaliation targeted civilians, and Karadžić ostensibly denying it, claiming, quote, no, military targets, unquote. And this supposedly reflected a classic form of cheating, according to Karadžić, by the prosecution. But what he didn't show you are the very next lines of this very page, lines which show that this denial was completely superficial and disingenuous. And those lines are shown here. As Banbury explained, when Janvier disagreed with Karadžić, based on what was by that point, that is in late April '95, the very obvious fact that shelling in Sarajevo targeted civilians, Karadžić simply switched tacks, moving from a false denial to brushing off the shelling of civilians by his forces with a joke and a big laugh. Maybe some of our gunners have bad eyes. Laughs big. In short, in order to falsely create the impression that the prosecution misleadingly cited a document which was actually favorable to him, Karadžić employed the very tactic that he falsely accused the prosecution of using. Not content with this brazen falsehood, he goes on to argue that only the Muslim side, quote, could benefit from the suffering of Sarajevo, unquote. And therefore, there would be no reason for him to engage in terror. That's T48007. Of course, this is directly refuted by the very exchange we just discussed with Janvier, during which Karadžić noted that the shelling of Sarajevo to retaliate against the other side for events elsewhere was, quote, an effective, unquote, strategy. Similarly, in March 1995, Mladic told General Smith that the intensified sniping of civilians in Sarajevo was in retaliation for Serb military casualties. That's at P2451, paras 94 through 95, and T13330. And Galić threatened Richard Mole several times that if events elsewhere did not go in the Serbs' favor, the city would be shelled. For example, telling Mole on one occasion that if the shelling from Igman onto Lukavica did not halt, he would, quote, fire his weapons onto the city of Sarajevo, unquote. P1426, paras 92 through 94. As Mole described the situation more generally, quote, there was an accepted norm that if the Serb side failed to achieve their objectives, and I use that in the widest sense in BH, so that anything from a local complaint to something else that happened within Bosnia, the general perception which I shared was that Sarajevo would suffer as a result, unquote. And Mole explained that this was understood to mean that artillery fire would be brought to bear on the city in response. P1426, para 91. Mole's observation was echoed by witness after witness. I refer to the evidence cited in our brief at para 609 and the concrete examples of Serb forces retaliating by shelling civilian areas of Sarajevo, as described in paragraph 736. Karadžić's claim that the Serb side did not benefit from the terror campaign is false. He himself confirmed the opposite, as did his subordinates, and international military officials watched it happen. At transcript page 8170, Karadžić invoked Bosnian Army General Karadžić in support of his assertion that the SRK used shelling appropriately to neutralize enemy firing positions. A wildly misleading claim that was exposed during trial when it was revealed that Karadžić said in full, quote, throughout the war, the Serb forces made no distinction between military and civilian targets. Anything that moved, including civilian pedestrians, came under fire. Hospitals, schools, and historical buildings received direct artillery, tank, and mortar fire on a regular basis, while houses, apartments, and gathering places, such as markets and water lines, would be shelled without seeming pattern. Nobody knew when and where a shell would hit, so every place was dangerous, unquote. Frazier explained that this description by Karadžić, quote, distinctly resembles the pattern that we saw, unquote, during his tour of duty. That's a T8170. Dr. Karadžić also spoke about what a, quote, terrible, unquote, and, quote, catastrophic, unquote, weapon multiple barrel rocket launchers were, insisting that the SRK never used these rockets. That's at T48015. And while they were not typically used, he should nevertheless make that claim to the parents of the 4-year-old girl killed in a rocket attack on the city center in late August 1995. And for that, see P1953, paras 98 through 100. In any event, Karadžić's acknowledgement that rockets should never be used in a place like Sarajevo confirms the inherently inappropriate and inaccurate weapon system upon which modified air bombs were based. And of course, it cannot be reconciled with Karadžić's case that they somehow became less, quote, terrible and catastrophic, unquote, when affixed to a 100 or 250 kilo air bomb. Your Honors, I now need to move into private session, please.
Yes, we go into private.
Wie in open session, Your
Karadžić also attacked the professionalism and objectivity of local Sarajevo police investigators, relying on sweeping generalizations to do so. His specific attack is reserved for an unscheduled sniping incident at Nehru Street. That's at T47958 through 59. Karadžić complains that the bullet's vertical trajectory was upward by 70 centimeters across a 2.5-meter room, presumably suggesting an angle that meant the fire was too close to be a served position, and that the horizontal trajectory was not calculated, but would have revealed that fire had not come from a served position if it had been calculated. Again, both claims are wildly false. As reflected in P1911, Karadžić has not just doubled or tripled the actual upward trajectory, but exaggerated by a factor of 9, by 9 times, claiming that the bullet went up 70 centimeters when it went up only 8, producing an angle of fire actually of 1.4 degrees. Further, contrary to Karadžić's claims, the investigators in fact calculated the horizontal trajectory using a tried and true method, as KDZ 477 testified. They used a piece of string to connect the entry and lodging points, thus identifying the trajectory which pointed to where the bullet came from, SRK territory in Dobrynia 1. That's T10977. Karadžić's remaining arguments about local investigators, T47989 through 91, are equally groundless, amounting to very general statements such as, quote, the witness made mistakes, unquote, and then offering through naked citations what is essentially a cut and paste of large portions of cross-examination, which he then dumps in the lap of the trial chamber to guess what it means and what significance should be attached to it. These broad allegations are replete with mischaracterizations. Many of the occasions where he claims a witness made a mistake are actually responses where the witness undermined the premise of Karadžić's question itself. Rather than revealing, quote, mistakes, unquote, by the witness, they reveal failures of cross-examination by Karadžić. For instance, Karadžić alleges that one of Necip Jozo's many so-called, quote, mistakes included his evidence at T9607 through 09 that there were more than 100 sniping victims attacked from the SRK's position in Spikasta Stiene. Karadžić then said, quote, I will put it to you that there weren't even 10 in total, unquote. To which the witness responded, quote, that is a ridiculous statement. We know exactly how many people were killed. We kept a record, unquote. There was no impeachment, and Karadžić moved on. Later, on redirect examination at T9644 through 46, the prosecution tendered P1991, the Stari Grad logbook showing dozens of killed sniping victims in Sedrenik, including children and the elderly. This shows that what Karadžić considers to be a mistake is instead examples where a witness disagreed with him and where the witness was clearly right. But this was just one of many such examples of citations he gave for alleged mistakes of local investigators in Sarajevo. He claimed, as another example, that Sead Besic committed, quote, cardinal errors, unquote, and then relies on examples such as T9439 through 40, where Karadžić simply disagrees with a witness about whether it was appropriate to move bodies after Markali 1. Likewise, at 9458 through 64, Karadžić's cross-examination fell apart as he attempted to show that a photograph depicted a different stabilizer based on its length. The witness demonstrated that when the stabilizer was laid flat on a table next to a ruler from above, as in the photo, it looked shorter than in reality due to the tail fins which raised the back of the stabilizer. And the witness then identified distinctive markings that matched the stabilizer in the photo with the stabilizer in court. This was clearly not a, quote, mistake, unquote, by the witness, but a mistake in perception by Dr. Karadžić. He lists transcript pages, as another example, from KDZ 166 testimony to show alleged, quote, mistakes, unquote, such as T8295. Again, there's no mistake. The witness simply stated that his personal task was not to establish the direction of fire, but that this was for the ballistics team on the ballistics experts on the investigation teams. Or T8316 through 17. Karadžić asked the witness whether he was aware that ABIH launched a military offensive the day before the SRK's modified air bomb attack in scheduled incident G15. And the witness said, quote, no, I was a police officer, I was not an Army member, unquote. Again, not a quote, unquote, mistake. Or T8321. No mistakes here either. Karadžić tried to get the witness to agree that a wire factory was actually making shells, and the witness said he didn't know. The same is true of Karadžić's claim that KDZ 477's findings were, quote, unusable. At T944 through 47, cited by Dr. Karadžić, the witness simply explained that he personally was not a ballistics expert. And at 10-977 through 978, an exchange which related to the same unscheduled sniping incident on Nehru Street that Karadžić falsely cited as having a bullet trajectory of upwards of 70 centimeters, and claiming that the horizontal trajectory had not been determined. Well, here, Karadžić reveals that he was actually aware that the horizontal trajectory had been calculated, and instead chastised the witness for not reporting in his diary or report that he used a string to establish the trajectory. Again, no mistake. At T980, the witness said, quote, in such a situation, you always use a string to carry out that measurement. However, I didn't have to write that in my diary, that a string was used for it. It simply had to be done in order to establish where the bullet came from, unquote. Mr. President, are we proceeding for an hour at a time or an hour and a half?
Originally, we scheduled 90 minutes for your rebuttal argument, but if it is convenient, we can take it.
That's fine, Mr. President. I mean,
How longer?
I will go the 90 minutes, so I presume you want to break at this point, if that was the same schedule. But I thought we were proceeding on the hour and a half schedule.
But I'm thinking that originally we planned a half-hour break between the rebuttal and rejoin the argument. But
right. So I thought
the chamber is just wondering whether half an hour would be sufficient for the defense to prepare, given that rejoined argument is just response to the rebuttal arguments.
It's Mr. President, we were thinking the same thing, that it was a little bit unfair to expect us to respond so quickly when the prosecution had such a long time to make its rebuttal. So we would like to have as much time as possible.
45 minutes would be sufficient, or do you think you need more than that?
Well, would you mind taking an early lunch, and we can work through the lunch break and give us an hour or so? Would be good.
And having heard your voice, it's better to have a break, short break, just 20 minutes. Yes, we'll resume at 10:23.
All rise. We will leave.